Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to leverage PowerShell for exploitation and post-exploitation. So the objective here is to contextualize everything that we've learned so far and put it into context in the form of how to actually use PowerShell during a penetration test, specifically for exploitation and post-exploitation. And we're going to be using a couple of PowerShell-based exploitation frameworks, or really just one, the primary one, and that is PowerShell Empire. So this video has a lab associated with it, and we're going to be going through the lab together. And this is quite a complex lab that involves pivoting or lateral movement. And I'm going to be showing you exactly how powerful PowerShell is when it comes down to exploitation and post-exploitation. So you can choose to go through the lab first. It has its own documentation, or you can watch the video and then go through the lab after, whatever works for you. So what I'm going to do is fire up the lab, and I'll see you within the lab environment. See you there. All right, so I'm back within the lab environment, and as you can see, you'll be provided with a pre-configured Kali Linux system that's ready to go. The first step will involve checking the target's IP address. Now, in the case of this lab, what has been done is host names for the target systems have been set. However, the IP addresses for the host names will be different in your lab. So that's something to keep in mind as you progress through this lab. So if I list out the hosts file here on the Kali Linux system, you can see that we have two systems at the bottom, and one of them is called demo.ini.local and the other is called fileserver.ini.local. So these host names will remain the same on your lab, but the IP addresses will change. So do keep that in mind. And that's something that will come in handy as we progress. So let's start off with the first system, and let's see what that system is all about. So we can try and ping it first and say ping demo.ini.local. If I can type that out, there we are, demo.ini.local, and we can see that that host is reachable from the Kali Linux system. However, if I try and ping fileserver.ini.local right over here, let's see what happens. So fileserver.ini.local, and we can see, no, we don't get any response. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that this system is inaccessible to us based on our current IP or the fact that we're not part of the internal network. It could also mean that the pings are being blocked. But in the case of this lab, this is the system that we'll have to pivot to eventually, and is generally speaking only accessible via the internal network that demo.ini.local is a part of. However, as we've been able to see, demo.ini.local is exposed to the internet, and this sets up the stage for a very interesting, realistic type of pen test. So let's get started. So what we can start off with is running a simple nmap scan on demo.ini.local, and let's see what ports are open. So we can see that it's running Windows because we have NetBIOS and SMB as well as RDP here, and we have a couple of interesting ports there. And let's perform a port scan on all the TCP ports, or the entire TCP port range. So we'll say -p- demo.ini.local. Now this will take a few seconds to maybe a minute to complete, so I'm just going to wait for this to complete. All right, so one port that we can see was identified with the TCP port scan on the entire TCP port range is this port here, 4983, which wasn't displayed earlier, which means it's a non-standard port. So let's try and see what's on that particular port. So we'll open up a browser and say demo.ini.local, and we'll say 4983. And there we are. Okay, so it looks like it throws out some very interesting output here. And let's take a closer look at what it throws out. All right, so we can see that it throws out some sort of error where it says echo of net use, and then points towards the fact that we're dealing with a Windows system. But it also displays the admin credentials for this particular host, or demo.ini.local, which is excellent. So how do we use these credentials to gain a session or a shell on this particular system? Well, one tool we can utilize is obviously going to be SMB-exec, because we know the SMB port is available. So let's try and stay away from Metasploit for the time being. So we know that the username is administrator, and the password, which is listed right over here, is ABC123321. We have the exclamation mark, @ and hash. All right, so we'll say right over here, ABC_123 321, and we know that's followed by an exclamation mark and an @ symbol, and then the hash symbol right over here. And then we'll close this single quote right over here, and we'll say, we need to specify the actual host we want to connect to via SMB, and that's going to be demo.ini.local, and we hit enter. And if the authentication is successful, which it is, it should provide us with a semi-interactive shell on the Windows system. So you can see it brings us into what appears to be a command prompt or a command shell. And we're currently under Windows System 32, which is a good sign. What that means is we probably have administrative privileges. There we are. So if I say, who am I? We can see we have anti-authority system privileges, which means we are elevated in terms of the maximum privilege that we typically want on a Windows system. With that being said, if I now say ipconfig, you can see that it's part of this particular network here. And more importantly, if I say, or if we go back to the hosts file right over here, and let's try and ping this system from within the this particular demo.ini.local host. Let me paste in the IP there. Let's see if we get any response. There we are. So we get a response, and we can now reach it, or this system is now accessible from the demo.ini.local host. Excellent. So now that we've established that, where does PowerShell come into play? Well, as I said, we're going to be utilizing PowerShell Empire. So we're going to open up a new tab, and we still want to maintain the SMB-exec session, and we're going to start up the PowerShell Empire server. So we're going to say PowerShell Empire server, and then once the server is started up, don't worry if you get any errors regarding building of particular modules. This will work just fine. You can disregard those errors. Once the server is started, we can then start the PowerShell Empire client and then connect to the server and then begin our offensive operations with PowerShell Empire. And more specifically, we'll only be utilizing PowerShell scripts or modules. So there we are. The PowerShell Empire server is started. We're now going to start up a new tab. Remember, you want to keep the server running, and you don't want to close any of the other tabs. So we'll now say PowerShell Empire client, and it will now connect to the server. And you should see that on the server page right over here once it connects. There we are. So we can see Empire admin connected via the API, and welcome to Empire. So as I've already pointed out, Empire is exploitation and post-exploitation framework built on or with PowerShell, or really for Windows systems or Windows engagements. So what we want to start doing now is we want to establish a session on the first host, which is demo.ini.local, and utilize a PowerShell Empire stager to get that reverse shell session. So now that we've set up everything, what we want to do first in PowerShell Empire is set up a listener. So similar to Metasploit, we'll say use listener HTTP, because that's the type of listener, and then it'll bring up these options here. Now what we want to specify is the host or the Kali Linux IP address, which can be used by setting the or configuring the host option right over here, as well as the port. So the port that you want to listen on, or you want the listener to run on to receive reverse connections. So we need to set the host to the host value to the IP address of the Kali Linux system. In your case, your IP address will be different. So I'll open up a new terminal tab and say ifconfig, and we want the IP address associated with the interface Ethernet 1. In your case, this will be different, so just keep that in mind. I'm just going to copy that value here, and I'm now going to say set host, and I'm going to paste in the IP there of the Kali Linux system that we're working on. And then for the port, I'm going to set this to 8888. something completely in something you can set whatever port you want. In our case, I'm just using this for demonstration purposes. Now that we've configured the listener, we can run the listener by saying execute. That's the command, and you can see the listener is started, and we can then say listeners to list out the listeners, and we can see that we've set up that listener, and we created it about 4 seconds ago roughly. We can now go back to the main page or the main screen, and we now need to set up our stager, which is in essence our payload, but we're going to be utilizing a PowerShell stager. So we're going to say multi, and we're going to say launcher, and you can use tab auto completion here. Now in here, what we need to do is we need to set the listener option to the listener we created. So we'll say set the listener option to the listener we created, which is called HTTP, and there we are. So we've set it now, and from this point we can just say execute, and then this will generate the PowerShell code that is obfuscated that we then need to essentially run on the target system we want to get a session on. And we already have a session on the target system via SMBXX. So I'm just going to copy this here, and I'm now going to go back into our SMBXX session, and I'm going to paste in what we copied and hit enter. And after a few seconds, because this is a C2, there we are, we can see that the new agent checked in, which means we got a session on the demo.ini.local system with PowerShell Empire. So if I now say agents, you can see that, and I'm just going to zoom out just to show you how this is formatted. So if I say agents again, you can see you have a table layout where you have the ID of the agent, the name, the language. So it's using a PowerShell interpreter, or it's using PowerShell to execute commands or whatever you want it to execute, the internal IP, the host name, the process ID, when it was last seen or when it last checked in. And again, you can again keep doing that based on the actual stager you generated. You can modify the check-in time to check in every 3 seconds or every 5 seconds. In our case, it looks like it checks in every 5 seconds. So if I do that, you can see there we are. So every 5 seconds, the target system will call back or connect back to the PowerShell Empire server, and we're interacting with the server via the client. All right, so now that we have an agent that's called back in or connected to us or that we can access, how do we interact with it? Well, we can do that by saying interact and then specifying the name of the agent, which is displayed here. So if I hit enter, you can see we're now interacting with that particular agent, and this is where PowerShell comes into play. So what's the first thing you do after you gain access to a system? What we do is perform local enumeration or situational awareness to learn more about the system that we've just compromised. So we can now start to utilize the PowerShell Empire modules, and in this case we're going to use the PowerShell modules. So I'm just going to type it in correctly. So the module we want to use is a pure PowerShell module. So PowerShell, and then this is under situational awareness, and what we're looking for is not network, but we want to perform some situational awareness on the host. And you can then use your arrow keys to navigate and select the module you want based on the action you want to perform. So for example, if I wanted to get the computer details, I just hit enter, and I'm now using that module. What I need to do now is just hit execute because it's configured to run on the agent that that we're currently interacting with. So I hit enter, and now you can see it tasked this particular agent to run that task, and the results have been received. So you want to give this a couple of seconds, and there we are. We can see the results of that PowerShell module being executed. It just performs local enumeration on the Windows target, and it just gets the computer details. So the logon type, the new logon account name, and all of that goodness. So there's quite a few other PowerShell situational awareness scripts that you can run, or modules that you can run. I'm just going to, I've just gone through a couple of them. But the next one, or the primary one that we want to use in aid of getting access to the second system, which is the file server, is we want to use PowerShell and situational awareness, and we want to use the network situational awareness module, more specifically the port scanner. So we want to perform a port scan on file server.ini.local ini.local, because remember, from the Kali Linux system directly, we couldn't do that. And with a standard command shell session with SMB-exec, we can't really do that easily. So we're going to use that module. And now we're going to need to set the target IP or the hosts option to the IP address of the fileserver.ini.local system, which we identified earlier on our SMB-exec session here. So if you remember, we were able to actually find it even in the hosts file. So in your case, the IP will be different, but we want to set the host value to this particular IP here. And again, in your case, it will be different. So I'm going to say set hosts. I'm going to say set the hosts value or the hosts option to that IP or the IP address of fileserver.ini.local. And then I'm going to just hit execute because we want to perform a port scan. So you can see it's going to task that agent to run that particular module. And the results will be received in a couple of seconds once the agent checks back in 5 seconds in this particular case. So we're going to give this a couple of seconds here to give us the results. And there we are. So we can see that on fileserver.ini.local, we have port 80 open, 3389, 445. And so the first thing we can tell is it's a Windows system because we have RDP, SMB, NetBIOS, and we have a web server running on port 80, which is extra interesting. So how do we pivot to this system, or how do we essentially interact with the service that's running on port 80? Now, there's many port forwarding techniques that you can utilize, but this is when we can now bring in a tool like Metasploit to aid in this. So we can say in a new tab, open up MSF console, and we're going to utilize a web delivery payload to get a Meterpreter session on demo.ini.local first, and then we're going to perform a network route so that we can access the internal network that demo.ini.local is a part of, and that fileserver.ini.local is a part of, so that we can interact with that service running on port 80, which is most likely a web server. So I'm now going to search for the module called web delivery, which will also generate PowerShell. So we want to use the first module. So I'm just going to say use one. And in this particular case, what we now need to do is, if I say show options here, we're going to set the target to option 2, which essentially tells it to use PowerShell. So if I say show options, you can now see it's using PowerShell. We now need to set the server host to the IP address of the Kali Linux system, because that's where we'll be hosting the actual script. So I'm going to say open up a new tab, ifconfig, and again, Ethernet 1 is the interface. In your case, your IP will be different, so keep that in mind. So we're going to say set the server host to the IP address of the Kali Linux system. Let me type out server host correctly, just to ensure we don't have any issues or errors. And we then want to set lhost to, again, the IP address of the Kali Linux system. We'll leave the port as is. And we now need to set the payload we want to use. So given that we're dealing with a Windows system, we're going to set the payload to Windows, Meterpreter, reverse TCP, because we want a reverse TCP session. And now, once we've configured the module, we can just hit exploit like so. And it's going to generate this PowerShell code for us, and it's going to give us a URL where that particular payload is hosted. So we're going to copy that link. It's essentially the Kali Linux IP, and it's running a web server or serving this particular payload on port 8080. It's a PowerShell payload. So we can now go into our Empire session, and we can use another module here. And we're going to say use module. In this particular case, it is a PowerShell module. So again, we're sticking to PowerShell, and this is all being done in memory. So we're going to say code execution, and we want to invoke the Metasploit payload. So you can just use your arrow keys, Metasploit payload, and the agent option is already configured, but we need to set the URL. So this is the URL from the Metasploit web delivery module. So we're going to say set URL and paste in the URL we copied, hit enter. And now we can pretty much just hit execute, and we should be good to go. So we'll hit execute, and we'll get a Meterpreter session in 5 seconds whenever the agent is tasked to run that module. There we are. So let's see if we get a Meterpreter session here. So it's delivering the payload, and we're going to give it a couple of seconds just to get a confirmation of the fact that we got a Meterpreter session. All right, so after a couple of seconds, you can see we get the Meterpreter session on demo.ini.local. It's important to remember that. The reason we want to get a Meterpreter session is again so that we can use some port forwarding automation modules like what I just showed you. But before we do that, we can say sessions 1. And if I say sysinfo, just to confirm what system we're on, it doesn't display anything, but we can see that right over here, if I say get user ID, we should have, there we are, administrative privileges or elevated privileges. So I'm now going to put this session in the background, and we're going to search for the auto route module, which is a post-exploitation module that just creates a route between the network that the target system we've gained access to is connected to and our particular local system or the Kali Linux system. So I'll just say this is the module we want to use, and we want to set the session to the session ID of the Meterpreter session, so session 1, and then we just want to run it, and it's going to create a route. There we are, added to subnet from the host's routing table. And what this means now is we can essentially perform port forwarding of port 80 on we can perform port forwarding for port 80 or the port 80 that's running on fileserver.ini.local onto our own system. So we can do that using a Metasploit module called server sox5. So we're just going to set up a sox proxy so that we can access that web server within our own browser in order to see what service it's running. So I'll just hit enter. The options we need to configure in here are the server host, which is in essence the IP address of your Kali Linux system. So I'm just going to copy that again, and remember yours will be different, so keep that in mind. And we then just want to hit run. There we are. So it's going to start the SOX proxy server, and now we can open up Firefox and go into our settings. And I'm just going to search for the proxy option right over here. So under settings, and we want to use a manual proxy configuration, and under SOX host, we want to paste in the, not our Kali Linux IP. Actually, yeah, we want to do that, but the port, we can just specify whatever open port you want. So we can go with port 1080. What this means is we're just passing it along. If we now hit OK and we try and access file server.ini.local, we should see the web server running on that particular host. And in this case, you can see it is a web server and it's called Bad Blue. So maybe we can find an exploit for this Bad Blue service, and we'll search for it on Metasploit. So I'm just going to say search Bad Blue. And we want to use the first module, or the module with the ID 1. And we now need to set the rhost's value to file server, and it'll automatically route it. So file server.ini.local, because we can now access it or interact with it via the SOX proxy. And we want to set the payload, because we're assuming it's running Windows, to Windows Meterpreter. However, because we're performing lateral movement through port forwarding, instead of a reverse connection, we want it to bind to that particular port. So bind TCP or to a port on the target system, and we want that system to connect back to us. All right, now this may not always work, but we're again doing it to see whether there's any outbound rules or firewall rules that block outgoing traffic. So I'll hit enter. And now we can just hit exploit, and if we've done everything successfully, we should be able to gain access to fileserver.ini.local and complete the loop. So there we are, it sends the stage, and we should get a Meterpreter session, and indeed we do. So if I now say sysinfo, you can see that we're running on a similar system. We should have similar privileges here, but now it's different. It's the administrator, which makes sense. So we've now gained access to 2 systems. So if I just put this session in the background and I say sessions, there we are. You can see 2 different systems on one of them, and you can see the IPs here just to show you that that did work. But there you are. That's how to utilize PowerShell for exploitation and post-exploitation. I'm not going to show you how to access the flag, obviously, but you can go through the lab yourself. And again, there's no restriction on the tools that you can use. You can use this, perform the exploits manually if you so wish. You can generate your own scripts for, situational awareness, for privilege escalation, although in this case it's not needed, and also for pivoting. I just wanted to show you what typically is done during a pen test, specifically on a Windows environment. So with that being said, that's going to conclude the practical demonstration side of this video.